welcome. This is our Wednesday 2 o'clock discussion, always on a different topic. And today's topic, as has been advertised, is really two areas of what we might call unusual profiles regarding the circumplex. And these are the topic of what we call bow ties, or I've also heard them called propellers, or opposing styles. So two extensions in a profile that are opposite to one another, what those might be telling us, and how to interpret that. The second area of unusual profiles to discuss are what we call expanded versus constricted profiles. Expanded profiles, and I'll get into a definition of that in a moment, but basically profiles in which most or all of the styles are pretty well extended beyond the 50th percentile, versus constricted profiles in which most of the styles are extended, obviously, perhaps below the 50th percentile. So the questions that we often get questions around these kinds of patterns in reports. People who understand the circumplex and its structure understand that opposing styles are typically negatively related to one another statistically, and really inconsistent with one another. So how can it be that we might find a profile in which we have both very high levels of things like competitive behavior as well as high levels of approval-oriented behavior? That'll be the first topic, bow ties, if you will. The second topic will be expanded versus constricted profiles, which are those that are, again, mostly expanded versus constricted, and what we can learn from those. I thought this would be a fairly simple topic to talk through, so, but after making 6 pages of notes, it's really not. There are a few factors that play into this, as well as the complexity regarding, what level of tool we're talking about, whether we're talking about this in terms of individual level, like LSI 1 or LSI 2, or whether this is playing out across teams, organizational culture, leadership impact, and so on, adds additional possibilities and complexities. So we have an hour today to talk through this. I'll try to get through it as best that I can in about 45 minutes, so that I can leave the last 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes to you for any questions that you may have. Yeah, so let's get into it. The only other thing that I would point out is that I've noticed internally that there is some slight disagreement among HS offices in terms of what constitutes a bow tie, what constitutes an expanded versus constricted profile, sort of what is the threshold at which we judge those to be expanded, constricted, or bow ties, that sort of thing. So I'll try to mention that as we go through. Good. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in as we go. And so if we go into the first file that I've shared in the Hightail document, this is going to talk about bow ties. Let me just make sure that I am. Okay, so this is coming from an LWS document that's been around for quite a few years, talking about the style description. So this is called the LWS Style Description Booklet. By the way, if you use LWS, it's a very nice resource. You should receive this upon accreditation, because it not only gives you a nice description of the styles one at a time as they are described in LWS, but you also receive the items within each of the styles. So it's really the only place that you'll be able to get essentially item level data within LWS. So if your participants are asking what questions we answered, they are here. In any case, toward the end of that document, we start talking about how to identify primary and secondary styles, and then we get into the topic of opposing styles or bow ties. So the first thing I need to say about this is that in all cases, these are quite rare, as they should be. For those of you who understand the structure of the circumplex and the fact that this is a simplex circumplex which means not only that we are measuring 12 independent categories of behavior, but that we are plotting those behaviors on a model with regard to certain dimensions, things like satisfaction versus security, task versus people orientation, and also in terms of their relationship to one another, meaning that the styles that are next to each other on the model are the most similar and positively correlated and associated. And the further you move from a given style on the model, the less similar and the more inconsistent the patterns typically become, until we reach opposing styles, those on opposite sides of the model, which are, in fact, we would describe, in fact, as being opposing or, in fact, negatively correlated. So for those of you who have gone through accreditation at any level, you may have remembered my recommendation that if we want to promote a given kind of constructive behavior, or if we want to decrease a specific defensive behavior, one of the best ways to do that is to focus on the constructive behavior that we want to move toward. So, you know, for culture development, if the culture is far too avoidant, then we should think about how we can promote and focus on encouraging self-actualizing behavior, with the understanding that those behaviors are inconsistent with avoidance and will help people to move away from that security-oriented pattern toward a more constructive style. Good. So let's start off with what do we define as being bow ties, and I'm going to give you my own perspective here. I'm not sure how consistent this is with everyone else in the world. But I really only consider bow ties to be a thing within profiles if they meet one of the two following criteria. One is that these two styles are the primary and secondary styles within the profile, meaning when you open the LSI report, you know, the primary style, the strongest extension is in perfectionism, for example, and the second strong extension is in conventional behavior. If that's the case, you have a primary and secondary style that are opposing to one another, then I would consider that to be a bow tie or a conflicting pattern, if you will. The other criteria that seems to work is that if both of these extensions are basically beyond the 75th percentile, we're using both of those opposing behavioral patterns quite frequently and with some predominance. So if you can see my mouse hovering over the second profile here, you know, if this was my LSI profile and I am at the 99th percentile of self-actualizing, but I'm at the 90th percentile of competitive and at the 90th percentile of approval, then I would still consider those two to be represent essentially a bow tie. They are predominant patterns within the profile that are conflicting with one another. Is this making sense so far?
Yep.
Super. Now, the argument could be made to a lesser extent that opposing styles that are not exactly on the opposite, so if this was conventional, here we go, competitive and conventional behavior, you know, nearly on the opposite, still may have some characteristics of these opposing patterns, but at least for our discussion today, let's discuss this with reference to those opposing patterns. Now, if I may just point this out right away, of the two topics that we're talking about being bow ties or opposing styles in profiles versus expanded and constricted profiles, I am far more interested in the first, these bow ties. These really do represent something going on that is interesting and should require, I think, some additional questioning and some additional digging from you, the coach, consultant, whomever is using the reports. Expanded and constricted profiles, I tend to find very honestly are interesting, but usually can be explained in a few pretty mundane ways. But these kinds of bow tie patterns are unusual. They are always rare, and they do tell you something significant about the individual, the team, the organization that you're working with. So it's important to understand these. Going back, if I can, very briefly to the circumplex, again, you should understand that opposing styles are inconsistent with one another. They're negatively related. So you can imagine that encouraging people, teams, and organizations to exhibit opposing patterns of behavior is inherently challenging to do, and therefore something that we rarely see within reports, and that is absolutely correct. If I can further break down the bow tie topic, I would break it down into two subcategories. Those are the bow ties that include a constructive style, such as what I'm illustrating here on the page, something like self-actualizing and avoidance, or, you know, humanistic, encouraging, oppositional, these sorts of things. A constructive style combined with a defensive style. The second flavor, if you will, of bow ties are those which share defensive styles. There are only two options here. This is perfectionism and conventional, or competitive and approval. Now, to be very honest with you, not only are all of these kind of bow ties very rare to see, but those which include a constructive style are extremely rare to see. I have only seen a few of them in 12 years of being with HS and digging diligently through client data, be it LSI, LWS, GSI, OCI, you name it. Combining a constructive style with a defensive style as predominant patterns is very difficult to do. It is very rare. It is very unsustainable. And I've only seen it in maybe 3 or 4 instances. Most of those are individual cases that I'll try to come back to later. Having said that, the combinations of bow ties which include 2 defensive styles are much less uncommon, meaning we do see these. And the sample OCI, OEI report that I attached in a Hightail file is exactly a cultural example of competitive and approval orientation taking place within the organization's culture. While those patterns are also negatively related, just as they are with constructive style, they seem to be more common because we're including 2 security-oriented motives. I think, honestly, the reason that we see so few combinations of constructive and defensive styles in opposing profiles has to do with the fact that you're talking about opposing motivations between higher order satisfaction-oriented needs and lower oriented security-oriented needs. And if you're familiar with Maslow, you understand people typically don't pay attention to both of those things at the same time. They prioritize those things. And so it's very difficult to encourage those kinds of incompatible, both growth and security-oriented motives. Having said that, that may explain why we do see some of these, although opposing, these patterns of defensive behaviors taking place. It is possible, and most of my examples typically go back to culture examples of organizations in terms of how they are able to create both competitive norms in the culture and at the same time approval-oriented norms, which typically do not go together. I'm going to try to talk about that as we get into the organizational level of this and how this plays out. But hopefully that makes some sense to you. It's harder to combine satisfaction and security orientations than it is to combine 2 sort of opposing security-oriented motives. Good. Then I'll talk about these satisfaction-oriented combinations very quickly, just to be honest with you, because I've seen so few of them. It's ridiculously rare how often they pop up. If any of you have seen these, please let me know, or please feel free to forward a report that you've noticed these patterns. Always interested in looking into them. The thing we need to keep in mind with opposing styles is that they are in nature opposing. They're not working do not work effectively together, whether we're really talking about a constructive and defensive style or two defensive styles. The example I usually like to speak to has to do with the example that I see most frequently, and that, to be honest with you, is the combination of competitive and approval orientation. The OCI report, again, that I provided in the Hightail folder is an example of that, competitive and approval. The second most common is certainly this perfectionism and conventional, and I'll try to give you a few examples of how that plays out. Good, so let's start there because these are sort of the more concrete. So when we think about it, these things in individual patterns, meaning when we think about competitive oriented behavior versus approval oriented behavior, they are inconsistent with one another. You know, competitive around the focus being demonstrating how I am better than my peers, drawing attention to myself, demonstrating how I am more competent than, more effective than other people in my team and in the organization. Whereas when we talk about approval orientation and the motives behind that, you know, trying to gain approval, make sure that I am liked by and accepted by everyone, especially typically people within my team. I want to fit in with them. I want them to like me. I want them to trust me, these sorts of things. Those seem quite incompatible. How can I compete against my people or my team while at the same time working to gain their approval? What we actually find when we look at these kind of opposing styles is just start off with, they're not happening at the same time. I am not behaving in competitive ways at the same moment that I am behaving in approval-oriented ways. These things are happening separately. They may be primary focuses of where I put my effort and energy, but they're not happening sort of at the same time or in the same place when we look in an organization. The classic example that I tend to give, and this does seem to play out, is, you know, I compete against my peers. I want to show that I'm better than they are, that I am more competent than they are, more effective than they are, and so on. So I compete against my peer group, and we'll bring this up later on. Secondarily, I am competing against my peers in order to prove that I am effective and so on, so that I am gaining the approval of someone else. Typically someone in a leadership management type of position. So how does this play out individually across various levels? Good. So let's use that, because I think that makes a lot of sense to continue the conversation. So in my experience, the combination of a constructive versus a defensive style in a bow tie is extremely rare. I've only seen it in a few cases, to be very honest with you. Those are typically LSI-1 cases or LWS self-feedback cases. And the two that spring to mind were both a combination of self-actualizing and avoidance.
Right.
I try to pay attention to these things when they pop up in our office. When we get a report that's, you know, 90th percentile, it's self-actualizing and 90th percentile avoidance, then I have some questions to follow up. And in both cases, they have basically played out along the lines of, you know, these are, or in those cases, these were highly creative, independent individuals who were hired into an organization because of their creativity, independent thinking skills, ability to lead across various cultures and so on. And they were brought into an organization which had a current operating culture that was much more along the lines of avoidance. So this gets to the topic that we run into in organizations around, well, you know, our culture is not particularly creative, so we're going to hire some creative people and bring them in, and that's going to change things. Unfortunately, what you find is that that creativity and self-actualization is inconsistent potentially with the norms of the current operating culture. In these cases, the culture was predominantly avoidant. And that the individuals, as they begin to work in those organizations, start to recognize not only themselves, but start to recognize the influence of the organization. This is really what was playing out in these LSI ones, where people were saying, I'm highly creative and like thinking outside the box, and I'm independent and so on. But at the same time, the organization is encouraging me not to take responsibility, not to get involved, not to speak up, not to change things. And those are inherently in conflict. And when people see themselves as highly creative and outgoing and are in a situation in which that's not permitted, encouraged, or seen as appropriate, in my experience, and this is what we're getting down to with the bow ties between constructive and defensive behavior, this is not sustainable. One or the other is going to win out. Either your creative person is going to say, you know what, fine, I won't be particularly creative. I'm going to keep my head down and do things the way they've always been done, and fall into that avoidant pattern, which is something we, of course, see with things like LSI and LWS data. Or those people will say, I don't enjoy working here, and this is something you'll see in their outcomes. I'm not satisfied. I don't see how I can create anything, any change. My skills are being wasted, and they will leave. And actually, the two specific cases that I have, which were LSI bow ties between self-actualization and avoidance, both of those individuals, in talking to the coaches who dealt with them, actually left those organizations, because I was hired because of my creativity and innovation and outside of the box thinking, but I'm brought into a business, and boy, this speaks nicely to things like leadership and climate, that do not enable me to use those skills and preferences and behaviors that I inherently value and contribute to my personal well-being. And therefore, they either adapt to the current culture and become yet another of your underperforming people, or in the two cases I've been a part of, they recognized, unfortunately, the negative effect the business was having upon their personal well-being and made the decision to leave. This also speaks to the topic that organizations have around, our best people leave. That's not incorrect. The people who are bringing the greatest skills and knowledge and competencies to your business are willing to provide those, given the opportunity to provide those. And if, I'm an achievement-oriented, go-getter kind of person and highly creative, but I'm brought into a business that I'm, told to just do what I'm told and follow the rules and follow all the red tape, those two things ultimately can come into conflict, and not only explains why the business is not experiencing more creativity and innovation in the first place, but also why their most creative people and those with the greatest skills to create that change are leaving the business. Good. Then, but in any case, so that was with reference to the constructive versus defensive patterns. By far the more common ones, and again, I've only seen a few of those. The much more common cases are defensive patterns, conventional and approval, and perfectionism and conventional. We do see those pretty frequently. We see those across all levels of our tools, so within individuals, teams, culture, and so on. And they are important to understand for a few reasons. First of all, conceptually, we're talking about people exhibiting opposing patterns of behavior predominantly, meaning, my primary style is competition, my secondary style is approval. That doesn't particularly go well together, even though I may be competitive in certain situations and approval-oriented in other situations. What you find is that this is sort of pulls the individual in different directions, which are inherently in conflict with one another. And the outcome that we tend to find most strongly associated with these bow ties, butterflies, propellers, whatever you want to call them, opposing styles, is stress. People become extremely stressed trying to maintain opposing patterns of behavior that have inherently different motivations and inherently different sort of outcomes and consequences. So whether we're talking about this at the individual level, teams, leaders, or organizations, if you see that primary pattern of opposing styles coming out, you can bet that stress is an issue within that organization, team, individual, you name it. That is not a healthy pattern to exhibit. It's not normal. So we need to dig into the next step, which is really, why is this happening? How is this happening? And what are the consequences of this? Now, when you talk about why we have these extended opposing profiles, styles, in my experience, when you simply talk to the individual or the team, you'll be able to get an answer around why this is taking place. You know, I see myself as a creative, outgoing person. That's how I've always been. Now I'm encouraged in this business to follow the rules and keep my head down and just do what I'm told. And those two things, while I'm encouraged to do both of them, are not consistent with one another. And in the long term, one or the other is going to win out. And secondarily, as long as those two opposing styles are playing out, you can expect this individual to be pretty stressed, in conflict, confused, how I'm supposed to react in various situations, and so on. I'll get into this a little bit further as we keep going, but ultimately, I think the nice message to try to bring across when we find these bow ties is that we need to kind of make a choice. Especially if it's a constructive versus defensive style, the choice tends to be very clear in terms of, well, which of these things do you as an individual really want to move toward? Is it achievement or is it avoidance? It gives you typically a very resounding message in terms of what I want to do moving forward and what is obviously holding me back. A lot of times people see these opposing styles as a challenging profile to interpret. In my experience, they're rare, but I don't think they're challenging. I think they're actually fairly straightforward. When people say I'm 90th percentile self-actualizing, but also trying to be 90th percentile avoidance, that individual will be able to explain to you better than you will the value of being constructive versus security oriented and the value of self-actualizing versus avoidance. You're not going to have to convince them. They are going to be saying, I love, you know, being creative and outgoing and experiencing new things, and I hate being boxed in and told that I'm not allowed to take part and not interested in your contribution and not part of this. So in a lot of ways, I think these are much easier to coach, at least individuals, in terms of how this is playing out, what you want to move towards versus what is holding you back becomes very, very clear. Good. Now, when we talk about this at other levels, we're going to get into other topics. For example, my favorite way to talk about this is at the cultural level, because we see a lot of competitive and approval-oriented patterns in OCI, again, along the lines of the report that I've shared. We also see perfectionism and conventional types of patterns playing out. And it's really an important thing to bring across, I think, to the client, because you're encouraging your people to behave in ways that are, at least in the security-oriented styles, first of all, not contributing to the goals of the organization, but secondarily, inherently in conflict with one another. There are several good cases specifically written around competitive and approval orientation. I'll give you the most simple and common case that I experience. Has to do with things like sales teams or other teams in which performance is easily measurable and comparable. So in sales teams, for example, perhaps we will rank order the sales team's sales numbers every month in terms of best to worst, these sorts of climate factors that are comparative in terms of looking at our members. That kind of climate factor is a wonderful way to encourage competitive behavior within the organization. So, you know, we rank order our salespeople, we reward the top 10%, we punish the bottom 10%. Now people are not only motivated toward achieving the best, but also motivated toward avoiding the punishment. So they begin to behave in these competitive ways, essentially working against one another within the team. Now, the way to add approval to this is to basically make their performance appraisals based primarily on what their leader or manager thinks of them, rather than necessarily these hard numbers. So even though we're tracking your numbers and rewarding or punishing you according to your sales, your overall performance review at the end of the year has a lot to do with just how your manager or leader thinks of you and their general sense of how hard a job you're doing and how well you're working and those sorts of things. These sorts of opinionated performance appraisals are a very good way to encourage approval-oriented behavior. I recognize that in the business, it doesn't really matter so much whether I make my numbers or not, but really whether my leader or manager approves of me, likes me, and these sorts of things. And those are the kind of climate factors that you can create to drive both of these patterns. I get the sense that in this business, I need to win against my peers in the sales team and be ranked within the top 10 or 5% of salespeople. And if I do that, I will inherently get the appreciation and positive feedback of my leader, sort of regardless of the methods by which I achieve that goal and so on. So I'm essentially competing against my peers in order to gain the approval of my leader, direct report, these sorts of things. So again, reinforcing the point, these patterns are not taking place at the same time. I'm not competing against my peers and at the same time trying to get them to like me. I'm competing against my peers in order to demonstrate that I am the best salesperson in order to get my leader or manager to like me. And if you reinforce those patterns consistently enough, then you'll get them within the organization's culture as primary and secondary styles, much along the report that I've again provided. Good. So that gets me further down the list in terms of what I wanted to talk about. The next topic that I would bring in is, you know, if we see these opposing styles, where do we see them? So, for example, when we look at individual level tools, things like LSI, LWS, leadership and management impact, then I would be interested in looking at breakout profiles. So an example of this is we look at the overall feedback, and yes, in fact, competitive and approval are both pretty strongly extended. But when we look at the breakout profiles, things like peers, direct reports, leaders, and managers, we suddenly start seeing different patterns. That's typically what I would expect, meaning when I look at the peer group, it's purely competitive. Let me get the right graphic here. Purely competitive behavior. I compete against my peers, and my peers see me as behaving competitively. When I receive feedback from my manager or leadership group, then it's completely along the lines of approval orientation. And then we can see that in the overall profile, yes, we have both of those opposing styles, but they're not, again, happening at the same time in the same context. I am competing with peers in order to gain the approval of leaders. And that it's basically people using security-oriented behavior to game the system, figuring out what it takes to get recognized amongst my peers, outperform them, and what it takes to be recognized by leaders, and using that within the business. Of course, this then links to culture. So I've had a lot of people recognize, much as I mentioned before, you know, we have an LSI report and it's self-actualizing and avoidance are the primary and secondary styles. Then we start talking to the person and they start conveying that I see myself as all that blue stuff at the top, but I'm in a business that is encouraging me to do all of these green things at the bottom. those are inconsistent with one another and also illustrate the influence, of course, of culture upon the individuals. And much like the sales example, leads back to climate in terms of what are we as leaders recognizing and encouraging? How do we recognize success? How do we conduct performance appraisals? Those sorts of key factors. Other things that are important to understand are, of course, things like personal situation. These are going to come up as well when I talk about expanded versus constricted profiles. Of course, if you look at all of our materials around best practices for coaching, we're going to talk about some good big questions you should be asking in the beginning of coaching sessions, like where are you right now? What is your role within the organization? How do you feel about that? What is working? What's not working? And so on. Much of what you should hear in that kind of questioning will relate to those opposing styles. Believe me, if an individual has those kinds of opposing patterns taking place, it will be at the top of their mind when they communicate to you their frustrations, their stress, their difficulties in working, because they really are utilizing inconsistent, incompatible patterns of psychology and behavior in how they approach their work and how they interact with people in the organization. Good. The final thing that I would mention has to do with outcome items, and again, with respect to bow ties. If you find these opposing styles to be predominant, then I would look specifically at your current level of stress and ability to manage stress if you're using LSI. Also things like your satisfaction in your organization, your accomplishments, your general state of mind, your overall well-being, these sorts of things. Again, if you're familiar with our Circumplex, you know that it has a very strong foundations in psychology. So if people are really predominantly using opposing styles, they will be experiencing psychological stress and strain from trying to attempt to maintain those patterns. It just does not work well together. So I would look for those kinds of outcomes in things like LSI 1. Now, if we're talking about it, I've tried to keep this constrained to individuals up until this point, and now we're going to start opening this up, especially as we go from bow ties to expanded versus constricted profiles, talking about this across levels. But to give you another point, you know, if we look at the bow ties, and that's not only something that maybe we're seeing in the self-description, but it's something that we're also seeing in the feedback description. Then again, I would be looking at 2 areas primarily. One, the breakouts. Thankfully, those are somewhat new and give you good information. If I'm competitive and approval oriented, then in my overall, then I'd be really interested to look at the breakouts. And what you'll probably find is I'm approval oriented toward my leaders and I am competitive toward my peers. And that will give you a lot of insights in terms of when is this playing out, how is this playing out, and help you to ask useful questions around what are the consequences of this and so on. Good. The other question I would point to is in the LSI outcome section in the very end of the report, there are questions around how consistent is this individual in their behavior? How easy was it for you to describe them? So this is going to lead into my next conversation about expanded versus constricted profiles, which we're running out of time for. But the idea being that if I am truly competitive with my peers and approval oriented toward my direct reports, then you could expect there to be a wider standard deviation in terms of things like how consistent I am seen in my behavior. I'm not behaving consistently. I'm behaving in this way toward these people and in this way toward those people. And that will inherently show up in the outcome around how consistent does this person behave and respond. And to some extent, secondarily, how easy was it for you to describe this person? All right, that's my bow tie conversation. Again, if we're beyond the 75th percentile in both, we should be thinking about this, or if this is a primary and secondary style, we should be definitely thinking about this. Let's talk about expanded versus constricted profiles, at least for the time that we have left. So hopefully you can see my screen. Wait, maybe I haven't done that yet. And document that I included, which is the LWS style descriptions. We have at the very end of that document a little bit of input on special types. And this is referring to constricted versus expanded profiles. Now, how do we define this? That was hard enough for me to figure out. I will go from the research definition that I have had within HS, although I will point out that there are differences of opinion in terms of when do we define something as being an expanded versus a constricted profile. The primary thing that we look for is really a constricted let me start with expanded because I'll keep up that pattern. Expanded profiles are typically those in which all 12 styles reach at least the 75th percentile or beyond. So actually this lower profile that you're seeing right now sort of barely reaches that threshold. In some cases, not quite, like affiliative and dependence. In any case, you know, 75th percentile or beyond. I understand that definition. That's really referring, I think, to the statistics and the norms, meaning it's expanded if you are above average in everything, and be above average in this case being defined as the 75th percentile. Now, a constricted profile is essentially the opposite. All styles are constricted around the center of the profile. The definition that we historically have used was that all of those styles need to be below the 25th percentile or less, which essentially this profile does conform to. Now, having said that, that's a pretty strict definition. I don't see a lot of profiles that actually meet those thresholds in terms of what is constricted versus expanded. I see a lot of them that are pretty expanded. A few styles, though, fall below the 75th. I see a lot of profiles that are constricted, but a few styles pop up above the 25th percentile. So I think it's less important to sort of define where the thresholds are, and more important to understand why this might be. And that is somewhat a complex discussion because it depends on what level we're talking about. The first two kind of things that I always go over when I see constricted or expanded profiles at any level, but let's start at the individual level, are two things. One is one is what's called response distortion, and the second is are these tools being used for what they actually should be used for? So let me give you the two. When I used to teach accreditations in the US, we had a few people from the research department, myself included, but who helped take part in that. And we used to talk about expanded and constricted profiles, specifically regarding LSI1 and LWS self-feedback. And what you really find, and I have to say this really is the fact of the matter, is firstly, these are extremely rare. To get truly constricted or expanded profiles is something like 5% or less of the population. I think it's around 2 to 3% of the reports where we will see this. Secondarily, I have to say the vast majority of these come down to what's called a response distortion, which is certain individuals tend to prefer to use one end of the scale that they are given versus another. So we need to keep in mind that especially things like LSI have a fairly short response option scale. You have a 0, 1, or 2. This is unlike me, this is like me most of the time, or this is like me always. Therefore, what we find is some people have a tendency to sort of hang out at the upper end of the scale. They sort of say, well, I do these things at least sometimes. I don't do anything never. I do some things at least some points. So they always use ones and twos to answer the survey, and that just simply expands the profile. It doesn't make the profile inaccurate. It just expands the extensions referring to the percentile scores. The opposite is true as well. We find just about as many people who tend to prefer to use the lower end of the scale, thinking that I don't do anything always, I do things never and sometimes. And therefore, their entire profile tends to be constricted around that pattern. Now, the recommendation that we have always had is the profile is still accurate, meaning even if I've chosen to only use zeros and ones, whatever is the primary and secondary style on that profile are accurately the primary and secondary styles of the individual. The only thing that's really sort of lost or distorted is the percentile ranks, because I'm no longer answering in a way that's consistent with how tens of thousands of other people have answered this survey. Thousands of people don't only use zeros and ones or only use ones and twos. So now I've sort of skewed my responses, but the profile is still absolutely accurate. So if you look at it and find that this person is primarily using task-oriented thinking styles, that's correct. And if their primary style is perfectionism, even if it's the 40th percentile and everything else is below, that is still accurate and still will describe what they're seeing in terms of outcomes and performance. So and to be honest with you, that's the vast majority at the individual level. People, and it is a small percentage, but certain people do tend to prefer using one end of the response scale versus the other, and that constricts or expands their profile. Now, if you understand that, then you understand that doesn't make any sense once we get beyond the individual level. Once we start talking about LSI feedback, that doesn't work, because the chances that I'm going to get 10 or 12 people to all use just zeros or ones, or all just use ones or twos is not happening. And I haven't seen it. I'd love to see it, but I haven't. If you start seeing it constricted and expanded profiles in those other levels, and I'm talking about LSI2, LWS feedback, LI-MI feedback, OCI, GSI, then something else is going on other than a response bias. And then we need to do some additional digging. So let me try to do this. Oof, we're at time. Try to do this by level. When we look at GSI, it's not a response bias if we see it at that point. The other question I'm always asking, by the way, and I skipped over this, is the tool being used correctly? So here's the risk that I have and have run into. We've decided to use LSI for selection and placement. We're hiring a new whatever, we're gonna see 100 people for that position. We wanna give them LSI 1 and see who is the most creative person. The problem with this is, well, there are multiple problems with this, but to cut the story short, it's very hard when people are motivated in that way. You're not going to get accurate data. People are going to answer the survey based on what they think you want them to say. And that can result in either expanded or constricted profiles. Either I really want this job and I think the company expects everything of me. So yes, I'm creative, and yes, I'm goal-oriented, and yes, I'm perfectionistic, and yes, I'm gonna outcompete everyone, and yes, I'm the best, and yes, I'm friendly, and yes, yes, yes to everything. And then you get an expanded profile, which is inaccurate. And again, gets to my second question, are we using the tool correctly? Or you can get constricted profiles. I've had this at the team, and I've had this at the organizational level as well, where everything is small. And then you start asking people, well, how did you answer this? And then they say things like, well, this isn't the first time that we've looked at leadership development, or we've looked at culture, or we've looked at this team. And the last time we did it, we used a different tool, and anybody who scored below a certain number, or anyone who said this, was cut from the team or whatever. Yeah, using the tools inappropriately for selection, placement, other kinds of decisions will lead people to feel like they have to answer the tool, and drives response bias. This will either lead people to say yes to everything because I think I should do everything, or they'll say no to everything. I'm not sure what's good. I'm not sure what's bad. I'm not sure what I should say. So I'm not going to say yes to anything. I've seen this quite a bit, by the way, in LWS feedback, where my boss is a complete dictator and I am terrified of them. And if I say anything that they don't like, it's going to be big consequences for me. I don't want to say anything on that survey that I could be held accountable for. So I'm going to go through and put zeros and ones for everything, because I'm not saying that I'm seeing the leader do anything that I can be held accountable for. This gets to my other point around, look, if you know, we're using the tool correctly and it's not an individual response distortion thing, then it's actually telling you something really interesting. It's usually telling you something about either the culture of the organization, the influence of leaders, what it means to be a member of this team. You know, if you're getting a constricted and expanded profiles, it means something in terms of how people are not answering any of the specific styles, but how people are answering the survey and what they think is coming out of this, if you see my point. The more fearful people may be, the more you may get constricted profiles, again, around, I'm not sure what's right and wrong, so I'm not going to say anything. Or I want to be on the team. I know they expect a lot from people, so I'm going to say I do everything. Neither one of those are appropriate uses of the tools, but do lead to both constricted and expanded profiles. Okay, the last piece that I'll use, because I'm already over time, refers specifically to leadership and management impact. So if you're accredited in those tools, hopefully this will make sense. And hopefully you've seen constricted and expanded profiles in your accreditation training. And those go back to the frequency with which leaders use facilitating versus inhibiting strategies. Essentially, facilitating strategies drive constructive behavior and inhibiting strategies drive defensive behavior. And if leaders actually use both with you know, strong consistency, which is fairly rare, they'll get both in terms of their impact. And I have a slide. Let me see if I can share it again. So on the left here, you can see two slides. This is LI on the left and MI on the right. These are leaders who use both lots of prescriptive and lots of restrictive strategies. And guess what? They encourage both constructive and defensive behavior. When we look at managers, same sort of thing, all right? If we use both strategies, you get both patterns. On the right, you get constricted profiles based on leaders who use neither one. And this is surprisingly common in both cases, really. We have leaders who don't use prescriptive strategies, also don't use restrictive strategies, and they end up with these really constricted profiles. And I've actually had them reach out to our office afterwards and say things like, well, do you mean I'm not having an impact on the people that I lead? And in a way, that's true. It's not that you're not having an impact. It's that you could have so much more of an influence if you know, chose to and were more conscious of the methods by which you lead your people. But it's nice to show that this plays out in the data as well. If we use lots of both of these strategies, you get both constructive and defensive behavior, although that may not be long-term oriented, particularly sustainable. Leaders who use neither one end up having quite constricted profiles. Now, I'm way over time here, 5 minutes already, but if I can just point out one last fact, the bow ties I think are much more useful and informative. They're telling you something about what is going on in your business, in your teams, and in your people, which is going to be causing consequences. They are going to be stressed. There is going to be conflict. There are going to be misunderstandings around how I'm supposed to do things if we encourage these opposing patterns. When we get to expanded versus constricted profiles, there are a few questions we need to ask. One, you know, is this just in the LSI1 or LWS self-description? If so, then let's talk to the person about how they answered the questions and if they tended to hang out at one end of the scale or the other. That, from my side, is not particularly, I don't know, exciting or new. We can still identify the primary cluster, are we task or interpersonal focused, what's the primary, secondary style, all good. And when we get the feedback profile in the report, that's probably going to look normal, not constricted or expanded. The issue with constricted and expanded profiles comes in when we start seeing that around things like feedback, GSI, and OCI, and then we need to ask some additional questions around how this is actually playing out. And I actually like these profiles because expanded profiles, you can tell people what they don't have to do anymore. Think about leadership impact, right? You're doing all the things to create constructive behavior. Great. You're also doing restrictive things to encourage defensive behavior. We don't need to talk to you about what you need to do more of. We're not giving you another task to do. We're not, adding to your plate as a leader. We actually get to remove things from your plate as a leader. Don't do these restrictive things. Take those off your list. Just keep doing the good, constructive, prescriptive things you've been doing. That's great. That's a very nice message. Also good for culture as well. We're doing lots of stuff in climate that's driving constructive behavior. We're also doing lots of stuff to drive defensive. Great. Let's talk to the client about what they can quit doing, where they can start saving energy and effort and money, and stop doing those restrictive things. They've got the constructive, prescriptive things in place. When it comes to constricted profiles, I think there's also a positive way to frame that in terms of, well, at least you're not doing anything particularly wrong, right? And thinking of leadership impact, you're not encouraging lots of defensive behavior. This is kind of the profile I would love to see from a high potential who's working their way up in a business, going through management up into leadership. They may not know how to create constructive behavior, but at least they're not creating defensive behavior. Now we've got a blank slate, if you will, to talk to the person around it. All right, you're here, you're not having a huge impact, fine. You're moving up into this leader position where you're going to have a big impact. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to lead your people? How are you going to guide your teams? And orienting them around those prescriptive strategies. And again, it's less around stopping what you're doing wrong and focusing more around moving forward, what you can learn from this and what you can do right, I guess. Okay, I'll stop there. Way over time. Apologies. Questions from you? Well, it should be justified. Why not? I can go on. Those are two different questions. Justified, yes, on the surface level. We've run into perfectionism and conventional, not only in individuals, but specifically in certain, as you've already alluded to, what Edgar Schein would call the culture of professions. So we've run into that in accountants. And I do remember specifically medical professionals in medical laboratories. So, we're processing blood samples, for example. We need to not only do that perfectly, but we have to follow the rules and be absolutely consistent all of the time. Is it justifiable on the surface? Yes. Is it effective? Absolutely not. And we can demonstrate that in terms of those medical laboratories that adhere to those kinds of opposing and defensive patterns, in fact, don't perform as well as those that function more constructively. The security orientation inherent in those patterns plays out in their outcomes, meaning if we really believe that perfectionism is appropriate, then we only believe that certain people can do this job and can do it right. So you have a narrowing of the skills and competencies that you're able to leverage in that business. Secondarily, if you're encouraging conventional behavior, you're telling those people that even though you're the one who knows how to do this right, you're not allowed to do it right unless it ticks all of the boxes along the way. And that is not effective. There's some great data from HS on the FAA, by the way, in terms of how we train pilots. It's a great example because you think you want pilots to be absolutely perfect and also follow the rules all the time. That's not the case. We need as pilots to understand what the goal is. It's not to hit every altitude and everything perfectly. It's to get there and safely. That's the goal. And this is a great example around what is achievement versus perfectionism. If I'm a perfectionistic pilot, I want to take off at 5 o'clock in the air. I want the gear up at 5:02. I want to hit 10,000 feet 5 minutes later. I want everything has to be perfect, when really in the end, what the people on the plane care about is, do I get where I'm going, and are we generally on time? You know, that confusion of goals is very much what you get with conventional behavior. Same thing with perfectionism. Same thing with conventional, you know, believing that we must adhere to every single step, especially when things go unexpected, when changes happen. It's a great example today with the whole coronavirus and the need to change how we work. You know, can we really continue to follow all of those rules our business has from home? And if not, does that mean we're wrong? Or great way to question those kinds of assumptions. All right, we're way over time, so thank you guys for hanging in there. Very much appreciate it. Again, have a look at the Hightail link if you can. I think you'll find some information there that'll be helpful to you. Otherwise, please feel free to follow up afterwards if you have any questions. Happy to help. And thank you guys for being here. I'll see you next Wednesday, I hope, for another interesting topic.